It never made landfall, and it never would. Lieutenant Commander Jack "Torpedo" Morrison pressed his eye to the periscope of his Grumman TBF Avenger and stared at the impossible sight spread across the East China Sea below. The largest battleship ever built, the mighty Yamato, was steaming south with a death wish, surrounded by 8 destroyers and a light cruiser in what could only be described as a floating funeral procession. No air cover, no support vessels, no hope of survival. But they were heading straight for Okinawa, where American troops were dying on the beaches, and that made them the most dangerous convoy in the Pacific. Aviation radioman second-class Bobby Turs whispered over Thintercom from his seat behind Morrison. "Is that really the Yamato?" Morrison adjusted his altitude to get a better look at the Japanese task force cutting through the gray morning swells 15,000 feet below. Even from this distance, the massive battleship was unmistakable. Over 800 feet of steel bristling with the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Her 9 18.1-inch main batteries could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles. If she reached the American invasion fleet off Okinawa, she could single-handedly turn the tide of the battle. "That's her all right," Morrison replied, his voice tight with anticipation. "The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And she's about to become the biggest target in naval history." The date was April 7, 1945. The war in the Pacific was entering its final stages, but the Japanese weren't going quietly. For 3 days, waves of kamikaze attacks had battered the American fleet supporting the invasion of Okinawa. Now, in a final desperate gamble, the Imperial Navy was throwing its last remaining capital ship into a suicide mission designed to break the American stranglehold on their home islands. Morrison had been flying torpedo bombers for 3 years, ever since graduating from flight training at Corpus Christi in early 1942. He'd seen action at Midway, the Solomons, the Marshalls, and the Philippines. He'd put torpedoes into Japanese carriers, battleships, and cruisers from one end of the Pacific to the other. But he'd never had a target like this. Operation Tengo, the Japanese called it Heaven No. 1, was supposed to be a one-way trip. The Yamato and her escorts had enough fuel to reach Okinawa, but not enough to return home. The plan was simple: beach the battleship on the invasion beaches, use her massive guns as coastal artillery to destroy the American landing force, then fight to the death when the ship could no longer float. It was a desperate plan born of desperation, and Morrison was about to make sure it failed. "Control, this is Torpedo 27. Morrison radioed back to the USS Intrepid, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I have visual contact with primary target. Request immediate strike authorization." The response came back within seconds. "Torpedo 27, this is Control. You are authorized to attack. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Send them to the bottom." Morrison felt a cold smile spread across his face. For 3.5 years, the Japanese had been learning the hard way that American naval aviation was a force to be reckoned with. Today, they were about to get their final lesson. But first, he had to get his torpedo into the water. And with no fighter escort and limited fuel, that was going to be the challenge of his life. 60 miles to the north, Admiral Seiichi Ito stood on the bridge of the Yamato and watched his radar operators track the approaching American aircraft. The first scout planes had found them at 0800 hours, just as he'd expected they would. There was no hiding a task force this size in broad daylight, especially when you were steaming directly toward the largest American naval concentration in the Pacific. But that was the point. Operation Tengo wasn't about stealth or surprise. It was about honor, about dying well, about taking as many Americans with them as possible before the war ended in inevitable defeat. "Admiral," his chief of staff reported, "radar shows multiple aircraft formations approaching from the southeast. Range approximately 100 kilometers and closing." Ito nodded grimly. 100 kilometers. At the speed American torpedo bombers could fly, that gave them perhaps 20 minutes before the attack began. 20 minutes to prepare his men for what was likely to be the last battle the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever fight. "Signal all ships," Ito ordered. "Prepare for air attack. All anti-aircraft batteries are to engage targets at maximum range. Fighter pilots are to launch immediately. "Sir," the communications officer replied quietly. "We have no fighter pilots aboard. No aircraft of any kind." The admiral closed his eyes for a moment. Of course they didn't. Japan's carrier aviation had been destroyed at Midway 3 years ago. Her land-based air force had been ground down to nothing during the Philippines campaign. The Yamato was sailing into battle naked, with nothing but her anti-aircraft guns and the courage of her crew to protect her from American air attack. It would not be enough. Ito knew it, his officers knew it, and his sailors knew it. But they would fight anyway because that's what Japanese naval officers did. They fought until there was nothing left to fight with, and then they fought some more. "Admiral," the radar operator called out, his voice tight with tension, "American aircraft are beginning their attack approach." I count over 200 aircraft, sir. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. 200 aircraft. Against 1 battleship, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers. The odds were so overwhelming as to be almost comical. Almost. Ito walked to the bridge windows and looked out at his task force. The destroyers were already beginning the evasive maneuvers, throwing up white wakes as they zigzagged through the swells. The light cruiser Yahagi was at increasing speed, her anti-aircraft guns training skyward. The Yamato herself was beginning a wide turn to port, presenting her stern to the approaching attackers while bringing her maximum number of anti-aircraft weapons to bear. It was a textbook defensive formation. It was also completely useless against the sheer weight of American air power that was about to descend on them. "All stations, this is the Admiral," Ito spoke into the ship's communication system, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive battleship. "The enemy is approaching. Every man will do his duty, fight well, and die with honor." "Long live the Emperor," the response came back from over 2,000 throats. "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" Ito gripped the bridge railing and watched the sky to the southeast, where the first specks of American aircraft were beginning to appear on the horizon. In a few minutes, the largest battleship ever built would become the largest target ever attacked from the air. And somewhere out there, in one of those approaching bombers, an American pilot was about to earn his place in naval aviation history. Morrison throttled back his Avenger and began his final approach to the Japanese task force. Around him, nearly 300 American aircraft from Task Force 58 were converging on the Yamato like wolves closing in on a wounded elk. Hellcat fighters provided top cover. Helldiver dive bombers were preparing for their vertical attacks, and torpedo bombers like Morrison's were spreading out to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. It was the largest airstrike launched against a single target in naval history, and Morrison had drawn the honor of leading the torpedo attack. "Target bearing 020, range 8 miles. Torres reported from his position in the rear cockpit, where he was manning both the radio equipment and the flexible 50 caliber machine gun that would provide their only defense against Japanese fighters. "Roger that," Morrison replied, pushing his stick forward to begin his torpedo approach. "Arm the fish. We're going in." The Mark 13 torpedo slung beneath his Avenger was the latest model, a 2,000-pound weapon capable of punching through the heaviest battleship armor. But first he had to get Klasinev to drop it, and the Yamato was already throwing up a wall of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a lethal constellation of exploding shells and tracer rounds. Holy Tara's breath as the first flak bursts began exploding around their aircraft. "They're really putting up a fight." Morrison said nothing, concentrating entirely on his approach. Torpedo attacks required nerves of steel and perfect timing. You had to get close enough to ensure a hit, but not so close that the explosion would destroy your own aircraft. Most torpedo bomber pilots never lived to see 30. Morrison was 24 and already on borrowed time. The Yamato was turning hard to port now, trying to present her narrow stern profile to the attacking torpedo bombers while bringing her maximum anti-aircraft firepower to bear. Morrison could see the muzzle flashes from dozens of gun positions all along the battleship's superstructure. 25mm cannons, 40mm Bofors guns, and 5-inch dual-purpose batteries were all firing at once, turning the air around the massive warship into a storm of steel and explosive. "Torpedo 27, this is Torpedo 24, came a voice over the radio. Lieutenant Jimmy Chen, Morrison's wingman, was approaching from the starboard side. "I'm taking heavy fire over here. These guys aren't fooling around." "Stay with it, Jimmy," Morrison replied, adjusting his approach angle as flak bursts rocked his aircraft. "Remember, we only get one shot at this. Make it count." Morrison was down to 2,000 feet now, skimming just above the wave tops as he closed the distance to the Japanese battleship. The Yamato looked impossibly huge from this angle, a floating city of steel bristling with weapons and crowded with sailors who were determined to die fighting rather than surrender. "Range 1,500 yards, Torres called out. "You're in the envelope." Morrison pressed the torpedo release button and felt his Avenger lurch upward as the heavy Mark 13 dropped away into the water. The torpedo immediately began its run toward the Yamato, its wake clearly visible as it homed in on the massive target. But Morrison's job wasn't finished. Now he had to survive long enough to see whether his torpedo hit its mark. He yanked his stick hard to the right and shoved the throttle forward, pulling his Avenger into a tight climbing turn that brought every rivet in the aircraft screaming under stress. Behind him, the Yamato's anti-aircraft guns swung around to track his fleeing bomber, filling the air with tracers and shell fragments. "Torpedoes running hot and true," Torres shouted over the engine noise. "I can see the wake heading straight for her engine room." Morrison risked a quick look back over his shoulder and saw his Mark 13 closing the final few hundred yards to the Japanese battleship. The torpedo was running at the perfect depth, its warhead armed and ready to detonate against the Yamato's heavily armored hull. Then it hit. The explosion was tremendous, a towering column of water and smoke that rose nearly as high as the battleship's superstructure. Morrison felt the concussion wave rock his aircraft even from a mile away, and he knew his torpedo had found its mark. "Direct hit amidships," Torres yelled, his voice almost drowned out by the roar of their engine. "You got her, Jack." "Right in the guts." But one torpedo, even a direct hit, wasn't going to sink the Yamato. The massive battleship was designed to absorb tremendous punishment and keep fighting. Morrison could see her continuing to turn, her guns still firing, her crew still fighting for their lives. It was going to take a lot more than one torpedo to put the pride of the Imperial Navy on the bottom. Fortunately, Morrison had brought friends. Over the next 90 minutes, American aircraft attacked the Japanese task force in wave after wave of coordinated strikes that overwhelmed every defensive system the Yamato possessed. Morrison's torpedo had been the first of many. By 10:30 hours, the massive battleship had absorbed at least 8 torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes, yet she was still afloat and still fighting. But she was dying. Morrison had returned to the Intrepid to refuel and rearm, then launched again as part of the second wave of attacks. Now he was circling the Japanese task force at 5,000 feet, watching the final act of a drama that had been 4 years in the making. The Yamato was listing heavily to port, her massive hull taking on thousands of tons of seawater through torpedo holes punched below her waterline. Her forward superstructure was a twisted ruin of bent steel and collapsed deck plating, her main battery turrets silent and useless. Fires raged throughout the ship, sending towering columns of black smoke into the afternoon sky. Around the dying battleship, the remnants of her escort force were in equally desperate condition. 3 destroyers had already been sunk by American bombs and torpedoes. The light cruiser Yahagi was dead in the water, her back broken by a direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb. 2 more destroyers were burning furiously, their crews abandoning ship as flames reached their ammunition magazines. "Control, this is Torpedo 27. Morrison radioed back to his carrier. "Primary target is heavily damaged and listing approximately 15 degrees to port. Multiple fires visible throughout the ship. She's going down, but she's taking her time about it." "Roger, Torpedo 27. All strike aircraft are cleared to continue attacks until target is completely destroyed." Morrison looked down at the Yamato and felt an unexpected surge of respect for the Japanese sailors who were still fighting their anti-aircraft guns even as their ship settled deeper into the water. These men knew they were going to die, had known it from the moment they left port on this one-way mission, but they were determined to take as many Americans with them as possible. It was a warrior's death, and Morrison could respect that even as he prepared to help finish them off. There! Torres suddenly called out, pointing toward the Japanese battleship. She's rolling. Morrison watched in fascination as the Yamato slowly began to turn turtle, her massive hull rolling further and further to port as seawater flooded her compartments. At 14:23 hours, the largest battleship ever built finally gave up her fight and rolled completely over, her pagoda-style superstructure disappearing beneath the waves first, followed by her enormous hull. The explosion came without warning. The Yamato's forward ammunition magazine finally detonated, sending a mushroom cloud of fire and smoke nearly 4 miles into the sky. The blast was so powerful that Morrison felt the concussion wave rock his Avenger even from 10 miles away. When the smoke finally cleared, there was nothing left but an oil slick and scattered debris floating on the surface of the East China Sea. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was gone, Torres whispered over the intercom. I've never seen anything like that in my life. Morrison hadn't either. In all his years of combat flying, he'd sunk cruisers and destroyers, damaged carriers and battleships. But he'd never witnessed the complete destruction of something as massive and powerful as the Yamato. It was like watching a mountain collapse, something that seemed impossible until it happened right in front of your eyes. All aircraft. This is control, came the voice from the Intrepid. Primary target is destroyed. Repeat. Primary target is destroyed. Continue attacks on remaining enemy vessels until all targets are eliminated. Morrison looked down at what remained of the Japanese task force. The Yahagi was already sinking, her crew in the water waiting for rescue that would never come. 4 of the 8 destroyers were either sunk or sinking, their hulls broken by American bombs and torpedoes. The remaining 4 were scattered across miles of ocean, each fighting its own individual battle for survival against overwhelming odds. It wasn't really a battle anymore. It was an execution. By 1500 hours, it was over. The entire Japanese task force had been destroyed, 10 ships and over 3,000 sailors sent to the bottom of the East China Sea in the span of 6 hours. The largest and most powerful warship ever built had been reduced to an oil slick and floating wreckage. Operation Tengo, Japan's last desperate gamble to change the course of the war, had ended in complete disaster. But for Morrison and his fellow torpedo bomber pilots, it represented something else entirely. The final proof that American naval aviation had achieved complete dominance over the Pacific. No Japanese fleet, no matter how powerful, could survive in the face of coordinated air attack from American carriers. The age of the battleship was over. The age of naval aviation had begun. As Morrison flew his Avenger back toward the Intrepid in the gathering dusk of April 7, 1945, he found himself thinking about the Japanese sailors who had died that day. Most of them had been young men like himself, kids who'd been swept up in a war they hadn't started and couldn't finish, fighting for a cause that was already lost. But they'd fought well, even facing impossible odds. Even knowing they were going to die, they'd manned their guns and fought to the very end. There was something admirable about that kind of courage, even when it was directed against you. Control. This is Torpedo 27 requesting landing clearance. Morrison radioed as the Intrepid came into view on the horizon, her flight deck lit up for night operations. Torpedo 27, you are cleared for immediate approach. Nice work out there today, Morrison. You and your boys, just medieval history. Morrison smiled grimly as he lined up for his landing approach. Naval history. That was one way to put it. He preferred to think of it as finishing a job that had started at Pearl Harbor nearly 4 years ago. The war wasn't over yet. There would still be Okinawa to finish, and then the invasion of Japan itself. But today's action had marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. No more carrier battles, no more surface engagements, no more desperate attempts to turn the tide through sheer audacity and courage. From now on, it would be American ships and American planes carrying the war to Japan's home islands. The Japanese Navy had shot its bolt with Operation Tengo, and American carrier aviation had stopped it cold. Morrison caught the number 2 wire on his first approach and felt his Avenger jerk to a stop on the Intrepid's flight deck. As he climbed out of his cockpit, Torres clapped him on the shoulder and grinned. Hell of a day's work, Jack. Think we'll see anything like that again. Morrison looked back toward the northwest, where the Yamato and her escorts now rested on the bottom of the East China Sea. 10 Japanese warships destroyed, over 3,000 enemy sailors dead, an entire task force wiped out in a single afternoon. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think we will." That was the last of them, Bobby, the last real fight the Japanese Navy had left in them. He was right. Operation Go had been Japan's final naval offensive of World War II. The destruction of the Yamato marked the end of Japanese sea power in the Pacific, clearing the way for the American invasion of Okinawa, and, ultimately, the final assault on Japan itself. The war would continue for another 4 months, but it would be a different kind of war, a war of attrition fought on land and in the air, with American bombers reducing Japanese cities to ash while American submarines strangled the last supply lines to Japan's home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once dominated the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, was finished, and Morrison and his fellow naval aviators had delivered the killing blow. As he walked across the Intrepid's flight deck toward the ready room, Morrison reflected on the strange turn of events that had brought him to this moment. 4 years ago, he'd been a college student in Illinois, more interested in baseball than world affairs. Pearl Harbor had changed all that, turning him into a warrior and sending him halfway around the world to fight in the largest naval war in human history. Now that war was almost over, and America had won. Not through luck or accident, but through superior technology, better training, and the kind of industrial might that could build hundreds of aircraft carriers while the enemy struggled to keep a single battleship operational. The Yamato had been magnificent, an engineering marvel, and a symbol of Japanese naval power. But she'd also been obsolete from the moment her keel was laid. In the age of naval aviation, battleships were targets, not weapons. And American torpedo bombers like Morrison's had proven that point beyond any shadow of a doubt. Morrison paused at the entrance to the ready room and looked back one more time toward the northwest, where the last Japanese fleet had met its end. Tomorrow, there would be new missions, new targets, new dangers to face. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that he and his fellow naval aviators had just written the final chapter in the story of Japanese sea power. The convoy that never made landfall, and never would, had been sent to the bottom, along with Japan's last hope of changing the course of the war through naval action. The Pacific belonged to America now, and Morrison had helped make it that way, one torpedo at a time. 3 months later, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison stood on the flight deck of the USS Intrepid and watched the mushroom cloud rise over Hiroshima. The atomic bomb had ended the war with shocking suddenness, making the planned invasion of Japan unnecessary and saving countless American lives that would have been lost in the final assault on the Japanese home islands. But Morrison couldn't help thinking about the men who had died in the Yamato on that April afternoon in the East China Sea. They'd been brave men, fighting for their country in the only way they knew how. They deserved better than to die in a futile gesture that changed nothing and saved no one. The destruction of the Yamato and her escorts had been necessary. Morrison understood that. The Japanese task force had been heading for Okinawa with the intention of slaughtering American soldiers on the beaches. Stopping them had been a matter of military necessity, not personal vendetta. But it had also been symbolic of something larger, the complete transformation of naval warfare in the space of 4 short years. When the war began, battleships had been the ultimate expression of naval power, capable of projecting force across thousands of miles of ocean. By the time it ended, they were floating museums, kept alive only by tradition and institutional inertia. Aircraft carriers and their air groups had become the new arbiters of sea power, capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away with pinpoint accuracy. The Battle of Midway had proven the concept. The destruction of the Yamato had confirmed it beyond all doubt. Morrison had been privileged to witness and participate in that transformation. He'd flown in the last great carrier battles of World War II, putting torpedoes into some of the most powerful warships ever built. He'd helped establish American dominance over the Pacific, clearing the way for the final victory that had just been achieved with atomic fire over Japan's cities. The war was over. The Imperial Japanese Navy was extinct. and Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison was going home to Illinois, where he would try to forget the sound of exploding ships and the sight of enemy sailors drowning in burning oil. But he would never forget April 7, 1945, the day American naval aviation delivered the killing blow to Japan's last fleet, sending the Yamato and her escorts to the bottom of the East China Sea in the final great naval battle of World War II. The convoy that never made landfall had carried with it the last hopes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. When it died, so did Japan's ability to contest American control of the Pacific Ocean. Morrison had been there when it happened. He had helped make it happen. And that, he reflected as the Intrepid steamed toward home, was something he could live with for the rest of his life.